welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. Our thoughts today turn to global health. We'll make the connection, hopefully sharply, in a couple moments to Silicon Valley. Our guest today is Dan Carucci. He is a physician, a scientist. He worked for our military for quite a while, for the U.S. Navy. Not what you would think, though. He ran their malaria program. And now you've got to stick around to find out why our Navy has a malaria program. Global health, this is the other end of the spectrum in Silicon Valley from where we begin. People struggling to raise money, struggling to make something happen. There's another world here in Silicon Valley. It's people who have made billions of dollars, have made so much money that the impact on their personal life is beyond anything that they could probably ever execute on a lifetime. And their thoughts turn to what they're going to do with their legacy. Maybe most famously, Bill Gates has committed, I think, 90 or 95% of his fortune to global health. Warren Buffett, as inimitably only Warren Buffett would do, said, hey, why would I want to start my own thing? Bill Gates seems to be doing the right thing, so he added his money to the pile. There's some interesting things that go on in Silicon Valley, billionaires, I'm talking to you, that cause maybe some distortions in how money is spent. The level of impact that the billionaires in Silicon Valley have on global health is quite interesting, and we are going to discuss it here with Dan Carucci. Global health, how billionaires can spend their money in Silicon Valley. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. This is the Something Ventured podcast. Our guest today, Dan Carucci. All right, welcome. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. Our guest today, Dan Carucci. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Kent. How are you?
Good. It is great to have you here. Our thoughts turn today to global health, not world health. We'll explain that in a second. In this podcast, I explore the reality behind the Silicon Valley headlines as I sit down with the people who are changing the way we we view the world online and beyond. And we'll walk the connection over here to where global health and Silicon Valley connect. Global health, not world health. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a term that I think most people tend to use. We talk about global health. It's a health that touches all people across the world, although I would say that when people talk about global health, they talk about health generally in the developing world.
Yeah, it's very snazzy. So we'll talk about your background briefly. The connection I'd make here is that as people in Silicon Valley come to great wealth at certain points in their life, maybe in a way that people don't come to great wealth in other parts of the country. For example, if you inherit wealth, if you work as a banker in New York City, you kind of make a lot of money your whole career. When you come to wealth in Silicon Valley, sometimes you come into billions of dollars of wealth, and then your thoughts turn to what you can do with that wealth. And one of the things you kind of come up with is Silicon Valley seems to focus on global health and education is the other big one here.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
It's funny, when I was working in Chicago, the people who had money all gave to the arts. It was always like the symphony and the operas. Here, like, very little of that. It all seems to be health and education. But why don't we walk through your background? How did you come to global health? You're in the military first, right?
Yeah, well, I'm a physician and actually a molecular biologist. I started out in the U.S. military really just to pay for medical school.
Right.
It was expensive. It's still expensive. Too expensive, in my opinion. Had no intention of being in more than the 4 years that I was required to.
Yeah.
But, one of the terrific things about being in the Navy was that I was given great responsibilities at a very young age.
Yeah.
So travel to places like Thailand and Korea and Egypt and Central America. And, generally Marines, Navy people are generally pretty healthy. And so once you've got things set up, what I tended to do is to go out into the clinics in the villages and talk to doctors and see patients, not see patients to treat patients, but to see what the health situation was in those countries. And so I became really interested in international health and tropical medicine.
Right.
So
how were you in the Navy that you were in villages? Like, how does that?
Well, I mean, so
Most of us think there's a boat involved in the Navy.
yeah. Well, of course, the Navy provides the doctors to the Marines. So I was actually assigned to the Marine Corps.
Got it.
And so, yes, it wasn't such that I actually showed up to the boat late and suddenly had to find something to do.
Right.
I was assigned to the Marine Corps. So when the Marines went somewhere, I went with them. And we usually found ourselves in tents as opposed to luxurious boat conditions.
Right. Here they're nice. Here the boats are really nice.
They can be.
Yeah. Okay, so you're in the villages.
Yeah. So, you see some amazing things. The Navy actually had a program in tropical medicine in Panama. We ended up going to jungle survival school for a few days and sort of to see, how to actually live and survive in those conditions. And so all of this was so appealing to me because, I think as I was contemplating a career in either internal medicine or something like that, this idea of just saying yes to something, seeing something which was so exciting and interesting, and something that I'd probably never have a chance to do otherwise, just drove me to this.
That's such a crazy concept. I don't know how I ended up in Silicon Valley. I mean, I can kind of figure out how I ended up in Silicon Valley, but it is kind of crazy. Especially if you're in the military. I guess your career takes you kind of all over the place and you see all kinds of things. And I guess if you're a physician in the military, you get to see a lot of the world. Yeah,
that's true. But I would say that, the military gives you a lot of opportunities. And I think that it's a challenge to find where you can break out and where you have to sort of toe the line, as they say. Toe the line, obviously being a Navy term. Yeah. But I ended up staying in for a full 20 years, but I was able to, during that time, I actually went to London and I did a master's degree and a PhD in molecular biology. And very great thanks to the British government because, they paid a scholarship program for me to work on malaria. Yeah. When I finished that PhD program, I came back to the U.S. and I ran a program, or I was heavily involved in a program called the Malaria Genome Project. This is a project which really fell on the heels of Craig Venter's sort of seminal work in sequencing the entire genome of a free-living organism, that of Haemophilus influenza. Right. And so that whole area of genomics was so cool and exciting, and we're talking about it still today. I mean, $1,000 genomes and things. It cost us $20 million to sequence a genome, a fraction of the size of the humans, and now you can get it done at CVS basically.
It seems so crazy, just that path in the military. So you were working with people who flew planes, right?
Yeah.
Was that that's where it began, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that was a very cool thing to be able to do. And I have to admit,
it's a really cool thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I was a flight surgeon for an F-18 squadron, and normally they're single-seat airplanes, but the second tour I had a training squadron, so we had two-seater airplanes, and I would go flying a couple days a week.
Had Top Gun come out yet?
Top Gun had gone out.
Oh my
God. It was really pretty cool.
And are those guys really as cool as they look?
They're pretty cool. I gotta say, I all of them, not just the pilots, but also the enlisted.
Guys.
Yeah. I mean, probably one of the most incredible opportunities in several years of my life was to work and support the Marine Corps. I am. Yeah. So we should all be indebted to what they do.
Yeah, there was a great, Mike Rowe does the TV show Dirty Jobs.
Oh, yeah, sure.
He lives here in the Bay Area, in San Francisco. Is a big Marine Corps supporter, and every year the Blue Angels come to town, which is the Navy
demonstration
guys. Which you watch those guys, you're like, holy crap! Like I don't even know how a machine can do what those things do, much less a person.
Well, what's interesting is that the Blue Angels don't do anything more or different than every other pilot can do and does. They just do it really, really well.
Yeah.
For example, formation flying close together like that is something that every Marine Corps pilot has to do.
Or the thing where they're up, I don't have no idea what the distance is, but roughly 1 billion miles. I think it's about 1 billion miles.
Probably more like 20, 30,000 with each.
And then they're down 10 seconds later near the Earth, level off in time. Obviously, every time it just seems,
and sometimes upside down.
Upside down, like I don't know how they're oriented to anything in space and time, and then all of a sudden they're all together and they're. I mean, it's pretty stunning to see.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah,
but you have to look it up online. But Mike Rowe wrote this long letter about it because someone was like complaining about the noise, like during Fleet Week. And he was just like, fuck you. Like, it was, that's a summary of what he said.
Yeah.
But he just talked about how great the guys were and how incredible it was and all that. It was like, it was a nice, thoughtful response.
Yeah.
But
I mean, the military they do a thankless job. And of course, they don't make the decisions when to go to war and go into combat.
course.
I mean, they just respond to, our elected officials.
Well, and you watch those guys flying, you're like, holy crap. Like, why would anybody, like, not just give up right away? Those things scare me, and they don't even have weapons on them.
Yeah.
As far as we know.
Yeah.
So how does the military get to the crazy thing? The thing that surprises me is that PhDs, malaria, like a whole range of things that you would think would be way outside the realm of taking care of,
Right.
a military.
Yeah. I mean, a good question. So why, for example, is the military interested in malaria, for example? And people forget actually that infectious diseases is probably one of them. There are more casualties due to infectious diseases than to bullets.
Really?
Yeah. So, for example, in Vietnam War, entire regions of Vietnam were sort of no-go areas because the malaria was so bad. And people would go, and you can imagine. So imagine as a commander sending your troops into an area, and within about a week, you have a 50% casualty rate. And it's not even mortality, but these people have to be taken care of. So they come back into the base camp. They take up beds. They take up resources. They're sick. So for the military, effective drugs and vaccines against malaria and dengue and other things are really important. In fact, a lot of the anti-malarial drugs that are available and are still available were actually developed by the U.S. Army.
Yeah.
But there's this interesting intersection about why the military and why infectious diseases. I'm really I'm not much of a military person at all.
Right.
I'm a physician and had some great opportunities, and I love supporting the Marines. But really, probably 2/3 of my career really was in global health, tropical medicine, vaccine development. I should say also, after doing the Genome Project, I ran the U.S. Navy's malaria vaccine program. So I have a lot of interest in this area. But, the thing about it is that, we send our troops into these areas. So we send troops into places where there's Ebola, for example. We send places where there's malaria and dengue, and we have to protect them in the same way we give them armor,
right, of course,
suits and helmets and things like that. We also have to protect them against the biological threats. And I don't mean biological warfare, but I mean naturally occurring infectious diseases.
I mean, it makes sense as soon as you say it. Of course. So that shift occurred while you were like the big shift to, hey, it's going to be global health. It's not going to be an office in Manhattan taking care of kids or whatever.
Yeah.
Happened in the military, in London, in the academy studying.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, it's interesting. You start reflecting back on 30 years and how did you get to where you are? And I would say I pretty much have had no plan.
Yeah, it's worked out pretty well.
It's worked out great, and I know a lot of people, tend to plan their lives out and say, in 5 years I've got to be here and I have to have this car and I've got to be doing this job, living in this town. I mean, for me, not having done that actually has led to some incredible opportunities. And I would say the other thing is, I tend to just say yes to things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, okay, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do that. Obviously you evaluate each opportunity for what it is, but be really good at what you're doing and those opportunities become available to you and say yes. So,
well, that's, the thing about improv, like that's the big thing they teach you, say yes. And so you don't go, oh, here we are in the crazy magical cave. And the right answer is not, no, we're not.
Yeah, right.
It's like, yes, we're in a crazy magical cave, and there's like Jane Fonda, and yes, and I talk to people on this podcast. That does seem to be the career path that yields the most interesting and sort of rich life, provided you don't have a plan and you're out there.
Right.
Like Silicon Valley, it's networking, right? Like meet people. And you just never know what opens up when you meet someone. And someone's like, oh, I have this company that you would have never thought of. When you're in college, you kind of, the world is like, all right, there's doctors, there's physicians, there's astronauts. Like there's like 3 things in the world you can do, or investment banker, consultant. And there's really, of course, infinite things you can do. And so if you have no plan and you stay home and get stoned all the time and play video games, it doesn't go that well.
Not too well.
But if you're out meeting people and open to things, it is incredible how the world sort of just brings things to you and shows you things, and suddenly like, wow, there's this crazy issue in Southeast Asia that needs to be addressed. I mean, it's an amazing way to direct a career.
Yeah, and I think the other important point is, and I've been very, very lucky because I was able to do it professionally, and now I tend to do it more and more sort of for leisure
as a hobby.
And that's travel.
Yeah,
travel. I mean,
yeah.
So getting out of your comfort zone. When I was in Honduras, which is a rough place now, it was a little bit better a few years ago. I was working with a group of Marines in a very small village. And, so you have to kind of get yourself out there and you challenge yourself. And each time you realize you come back from that experience enriched, having met interesting people, having done great things, not only does it build your resume, which is a good thing to have, and people should be, especially young people, should be thinking about their resume more than they really are. Basically it's like networking across the developing world in a lot of ways,
Right.
So you may be networking, or folks in Silicon Valley may be networking, through sort of events and conferences and things. I think it's, the fact that you can travel and meet interesting people, do interesting things is, a form of networking, and that's important.
Yeah. There's a few guys. So the benefit to Silicon Valley, perhaps the knock on it, is it's sort of like, well, I went to public high school in California, so I'll get this wrong, but Rome, and whenever Rome was big,
right?
What was that, the 60s? The 50s? Something, I don't know. But like when it was the capital city, like you were kind of, if you wanted to fight the battles and be the guy, you wanted to be in Rome. You didn't want to be off in, wherever, like the reaches of the Roman Empire. So right now, Silicon Valley for technology is the center of the universe. Yeah. So everyone's here. If they do something successful, like Mark Zuckerberg in Boston, they move here. But there are a few VCs now who, Dave McClure is one of 500 startups, who says, everyone can't move to Silicon Valley. Like it can't be, just physically, mathematically, can't be the case that everyone moves here. And so he's one of the few venture firms who has funds focused now on Mexico, Chile, Singapore. I'll get this wrong. Maybe one in Africa, kind of like all over the world. Because it is amazing as you travel, and you kind of, you forget that there's this whole thing going on in China, and they don't really give it. People in China don't really care about the people in the U.S. Like they're starting companies where they're like, we've got 1 billion people here. Like we don't need your extra 250 million. And so you get companies like Tencent, which is a big company in China and all that. But it really does give you just such a great perspective on like what's going on in the world. I love reading the newspapers when I'm somewhere else. Like when you're in New Zealand, you read the newspaper.
Sure.
And it's all about like the trans-Tasman conflict over the thing that you've never heard of with the guys you never heard of. You're like, oh, they're not covering the U.S. stuff. Like, this is crazy. Yeah, they don't really care.
And there's great things happening in Africa, for example. Africa's poised to grow, 3 to 5%?
Right.
No, 5 to 6%. Africa has major problems, infrastructure problems. And so like foreign direct investment is low because of things like, perceived corruption. And then you look at a country like Nigeria, which just had an election, which was a peaceful transition of power. And I think everyone was really, really worried what was going to happen.
Right.
Now, there are still ongoing problems, but, it sort of gives you hope that, working and investing in places like Africa actually can happen.
So the word on the street is Ebola's over. Is this true?
Well, it's interesting. Yesterday, I think it was, Liberia announced that it's now Ebola free. There's been no new cases in 42 days.
Yep.
But of course, Sierra Leone and Guinea, just next door, continue to have Ebola cases, and the borders are not as tight as they are here. There's a lot of, in fact, the borders are quite porous, and families often travel back and forth across the borders freely, so we're all very hopeful that the situation in Sierra Leone and Guinea will take care of themselves, of course, with lots of help from the international community. But I think we're all still a bit worried.
So what happens as tech moguls turn their capital to global health?
Yeah.
Bill Gates famously did a TED Talk where the mosquitoes, he let mosquitoes out of a jar or something like that. I'm not sure what the point was. I never saw the TED Talk, but I saw a picture of Bill Gates with mosquitoes.
Yeah.
Is he the biggest one in tech? Turning his, that
Yes,
seems like a lot of capital.
Clearly, his foundation has, I don't know, I think it's $45 billion in endowment, which they spend. They actually have to spend 10% of the endowment per year to maintain their tax status. So it's a huge amount of influence. An organization that can spend $4.5 billion on global health and also education and other things, as they do, actually has a huge amount of influence. It's interesting, actually, the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates got interested in global health primarily, as if I recall this correctly, through an interest in getting rid of polio.
Okay.
So Ted Turner, actually another famous billionaire, invested some money into polio and actually challenged Bill Gates to invest some of his money to eradicate polio. And we're close. We still have a couple of pockets of polio, which mostly are happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but we're very, very close.
So Bill Gates then puts $45 billion behind it.
Yeah, in his endowment. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Problem's not solved yet, though, it seems. Like,
No.
So what do the tech guys get right or wrong? They seem to come into giving, this is just my impression, being a little bit more involved than most people. Like, they have their ideas, like, oh, education should be entrepreneurial or libertarian, or outcomes should be measured or whatever, which is, kind of the hubris of a tech guy who built a successful company, maybe. I think I know how to do this. Like, how hard can it be?
Well, let's put it in perspective. So Bill Gates spends $4.5 billion, if I've got the numbers right, in philanthropy. The vast majority of that, I don't know the percentage, is in global health. He also supports programs in education and probably some other things too. But if you look at the global investment, so this is governments, U.S. government, Canada, Britain, the number is something like $27 billion per year in development assistance for health. Mm-hmm. So so the Gates Foundation investment, still significant, and that's part of the $27 billion. It's still small, much, much smaller than all of the other investments combined. So, and then you start looking at, and of course, he's by far and away the largest. Paul Allen just announced a few months ago that he's going to be investing, or has been investing, $100 million to help get rid of Ebola. So, and that's a relatively short-term commitment, but still, the numbers are small. And I think while the development community, people who work in global health, really appreciate the interest and, of course, the finances that go into global health, solving global health problems, there can be a problem where the money drives projects as opposed to projects driving where the money goes. Mm-hmm. And that can be a problem, particularly people. And I think it's, look, it's people's money. They can sort of do what they want with it. I guess, from those of us who've been around in the global health community a while, if that money can be used to solve problems that would then leverage the bigger investment. So how do you take the $27 billion and make it more impactful? Get rid of these 2 or 3 or 4 barriers, which could be innovation barriers, technology barriers. They could be as simple as communications barriers. I'll just deviate slightly here and say, we don't necessarily need lots and lots of new innovations. I mean,
so this is probably where the tech guys get it wrong, because what the tech, I bet the tech guys don't want to invest in like
hand washing.
Yes. Okay. Right.
Exactly.
Like what does hand washing like get?
Well, I tell you, there are right now. Let's see, 1990 there were 20 million children that died every year. Jeez. Last year there were 6 million. Slightly over 6 million children died per year last year. There are almost 280,000 women die in childbirth. And I should say, today is Mother's Day. Mm-hmm. So happy Mother's Day to all those women. But also realize that 280,000 mothers are not here to celebrate Mother's Day because they died during childbirth. Yeah. So we've made a lot of progress. And there have been some really terrific interventions and innovations. But a lot of it is just simple behaviors. So, I think one of the areas where the business community and tech community could get involved in global health is, have a look at the landscape. When an innovator comes in, they don't just develop something, right? They look at the landscape and see what else is out there, right? So you don't want to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Where are the places where technology could be beneficial? And maybe it's a new device, maybe it's a new thing, but maybe it's a new business practice. Maybe it's a new approach. Maybe it's a new marketing strategy. Some of those things actually could be incredibly impactful because the stuff's out there, but people don't access it.
Well, there's the story of there's a couple of these. Water in India.
Yeah.
Watching it, that the water is just very, very polluted, and so one solution is to provide toilets.
Right.
But it turns out that providing toilets also doesn't necessarily solve the problem by itself, right? So
It's a great story because in fact recently there was a project. I think several $1 million went into this project where toilets were installed into communities. Other communities were left as sort of the control, so to speak. Experiment, basically, yeah. And after about 3 years, what did they find? They found actually there was the incidence, so this is the number of cases of a disease over time, was no different in the villages that had toilets versus those that didn't. But if you start unpacking that a little bit more, you realize that, in fact, the usage of those toilets, people didn't use the toilets, right? There was no marketing strategy that would have encouraged people, changed the behavior, which is normally just going out in the field, which is what people have been doing for thousands of years, more probably.
Right.
And so there's no strategy that was built in to get them to use it. So the unfortunate conclusion is toilets don't work, which is wrong. And in fact, there was a recent editorial which talked about the fact that maybe we should not be investing in toilets. That's a bad thing. Because toilets could work if they're used correctly.
So the guys who were doing the study were probably, well, I'd prefer a toilet. Like, I'd prefer the Four Seasons. So
yeah, the people who
it just didn't occur to them that somebody who never used a toilet wouldn't just naturally go, that's a better way to go.
Well, then it becomes, this is where the problem is, that you've got toilets being a technical solution, not very technical, low tech, but still a technical solution to a problem. People out here would never just develop, successful companies would never develop a technology which does not talk about how it gets incorporated into people's lives, right? You have to have an emotional component to whatever the technology is you're using. You have to love it, right, in order to drive it and use it and share it. And we need more of that in the developing world.
A little more market research. Although they get it wrong here sometimes too. We just had there's a crazy one where Pepsi had some can that said like, removes no from your vocabulary or something, which a bunch of people.
Not Pepsi. There was
Sorry.
a beer. Yeah.
Don't want to go to podcast court for that. It was a beer company that did it.
Beer company, yeah.
And clearly everybody in the beer company, it's one of those things where your brain's just not engaged a whole bunch of times and it got out there.
Yeah.
But sometimes you don't know the information. Like you tell the story of the mosquito nets that were the wrong color.
Yeah, I mean it's quite a famous story when mosquito nets were first developed. There was 3 million children were dying every year due to malaria. And if a child just slept underneath this insecticide-treated bed net, it would prevent the kids from getting malaria, plus it would reduce the burden of mosquitoes in the community. In northern Nigeria, no one was using the bed nets that were given to them for free. And when you started looking into this, you realized that actually cultural practice meant that when a child died, they were wrapped in a white Muslim cloth. Okay? Mm-hmm. So the problem, of course, was the bed nets were white. So putting a child underneath the bed net was akin to wrapping a child into a Muslim cloth.
Yeah.
When the color of the bed net was changed to blue or green, I don't remember, then bed net utilization went up.
So really bad market research in this case.
Exactly, consumer research. Know your market, know what you're doing. I mean, the problem in the development community is that people oftentimes think they know what people need. And those communication strategies, the messaging is developed, in Seattle or in Washington or New York or London, and then it's put forward into the communities. And unfortunately, the structure is such that, even if those messages are shown not to be working, there's really not a good mechanism to change the messaging because you're on a grant, and the grant has a 3-year life cycle and has metrics and milestones. So there's really not a good message.
Is there any concept of, it's kind of this weird thought experiment of like, I don't know, noblesse oblige or whatever you call it, where these people are coming in to help. Like, does everybody want the help? Like if a bunch of people came here and showed up in my neighborhood and said, hey, we're from Africa.
Yeah.
We hear you got some problems with vaccines or whatever. We want to educate you.
Yeah.
Or we want to give you some medicine or something. We'd be enormously offended.
Yeah.
Is it just that's when you're poor enough and have enough needs, you don't have that, or
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think that people really welcome the help of countries like the U.S. and others, and of course all the NGOs that do such great work. Médecins Sans Frontières, of course, a leader in the work in Ebola. Some of it done really thanklessly. But you do have to be careful about sort of parachuting in and dropping off in innovation, and then sort of leaving and making yourself feel good without really understanding what the impact is going to be. And in fact, it can go against you too. And some, of course, polio vaccine is a great example where it can be viewed as sort of a Western project. Getting rid of polio in parts of the world where polio really doesn't happen that often. It's still there. This is a solution that the West is working to eliminate, obviously for the benefit of the people who live there, but it's got to be perceived as a problem for the local communities for them to really take it up. And of course, in places, for example, where you've got a lot of suspicions about the U.S. government's interest in West, Boko Haram being a great example, where everything Western is rejected. Something that's perceived as being a derivative of something from the West now becomes, something that you reject.
Oh, right. Even if we do that here.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Jenny McCarthy does that here, so so I'm not sure how far ahead of them we are on that one.
Yeah.
So as the tech executives invest, and as more and more, I assume these fortunes that are being created, eventually Mark Zuckerberg and those guys will. I'm guessing they're going to turn toward global health because the symphony doesn't need that much money.
Right. Well,
I
can't comment on that.
All respect to the symphony.
Yes.
You guys are great.
Yeah.
Is there a lesson for? I mean, is it the issue? I get the issue, which is like, hey, if everybody just got a bar of soap and used it, X good things would happen. Mark Zuckerberg's probably not excited about writing $100 billion check for how big the check is for soap.
Right. Yeah. I think there's some really interesting strategies that people ought to be thinking about. I mean, first of all, it's really easy to write a check, and it's easy to make you feel good. Of course, people will welcome those funds. But I think, the way the tech executives ought to be thinking about this is, most of them I think are problem solvers. I mean, I would guess, I don't know.
That's how you get that job. Yeah.
That's how you get the job. You're trying to solve a problem. So, do a real deep dive in terms of what the problem is, and engage with people, who've been in the global health community for a while, who really give you, I think, try to give you impartial advice about where to invest your funds. Number one, I think that's important because we want to be able to leverage the fact that we've got these tens of billions of dollars that are already going into development assistance for health. Why isn't it having a greater impact? So, do a net landscape analysis of that problem. Number two, I think the other important place where the tech community and the business community in general could help is what makes a company successful. Right? And use that same principle and apply it to the development community. What are you measuring? So how do you measure success of a project? What do you kill and when do you kill a project? What are the metrics for that? And be really sometimes ruthless, I'm sure.
That's always a tough one in nonprofits.
Oh, it's
like
really
killing things. I mean, it happens in Silicon Valley where people don't kill their own company.
Yeah.
They're like, well, we're going to do all this analysis about, how our product should work. But they never go, well, maybe nobody even wants your service or product. So It's hard enough. I'm sure it's hard with global health organizations to go, we don't really need the Ebola eradication unit. We should focus on something else.
Well, I mean, I think the problem in one of the problems in the development community, it can be that the things that people measure can also mean that the perception of projects succeeding or failing will be derived from those metrics. And so if you're interested in the next grant, right, you've got to succeed. And so the system is sort of set up for not allowing for real objective failure. To understand where a project is going to fail, unfortunately, will compromise that organization's ability to get the next round of funding. You want to be able to succeed. And the funders also, go back to Congress, have got to show success. So you don't want to send up a project where you're measuring things that will potentially show failure. So what do? You measure things that's easy to measure and for which you can easily control the outputs, right? It's usually outputs that people measure.
Yep.
So it's tough. I mean, it's really tough, and I totally get it. It's very complex. But the business community could help, I think, in terms of helping the development community establish metrics, milestones, and then have sufficient flexibility to change the strategy to allow for success. So I think that's another area that the development community could learn from the business on. Be sufficiently flexible to change your strategy midstream. Because if it's not working, don't keep doing it.
And that actually might be where Silicon Valley has some use, because if you're in a venture capital mode or company mode, you're used to saying, hey, 9 out of 10 things are going to fail.
Right.
The trick is to do them, fail as quickly as you can. Don't give up.
As can.
Yeah, as cheaply as you can. And now you know, like with Uber, you learned, hey, people don't want to share cars. They want to share rides. Like, oh, that was a pretty big piece of information, and now there's a big company. So people from Silicon Valley might be a little more open to the fact that, hey, we tried this thing and we're just going to kill it. Like, that's not how you cost effectively get rid of Ebola. We're okay with that.
Right.
Being a path not taken versus the, maybe the sort of complexity of how you have to get yourself funded with a traditional grant.
Yeah. No, I think it's really important.
They might be quicker to write checks and lose money, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing is that the philanthropy community has to also understand they're going to be in it for more than just a very short time frame. I mean, if the best way to be involved is to take a long-term view of their involvement. It's going to fluctuate in terms of how much funds and resources they have available, but certainly their expertise and the business processes and thinking is something that the development community could really benefit from over the long term.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I was thinking, why don't we wrap this up? A story about in Africa. You were telling me about entrepreneurship in Africa,
right? And
people kind of go to Africa. A lesson 1: go to where the problem is, find a problem, solve it, create a business out of it. What country were we talking about?
I think it was in Tanzania.
Yeah. It's so fun. By the way, people in the U.S. who haven't traveled to Africa,
right,
couldn't place South America a little bit. Africa, it's bad, but you can't place these on the map.
Tanzania is in the eastern part of Africa.
Yeah, so
in the middle, kind of.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you said this story took place in Nigeria, nobody would debate you. But anyway, sorry, Tanzania. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's lots of opportunities for entrepreneurialism. I said earlier that, we sometimes don't need, new things, new technologies. We do in some places, but, we need innovation. The story I was telling you about was, a very small NGO, a couple that I met, a young couple that I met. I think they're from Canada. I met them 2 years ago, and they moved to Tanzania, and they saw a problem, which was that young girls weren't attending school after the age of about 12. And they looked at this problem, and it turned out that when they went through adolescence, and they didn't have access to sanitary pads, something as simple as that. And so the girls were embarrassed to go to school, and so they stopped going, and particularly going during that week time frame. So this young couple came up with something called AfriPads. And AfriPads are a totally local thing. They hire women, they manufacture them, they sell them and distribute them. Sometimes they're subsidized, but they're developing a business out of it. And I was so excited to see the passion that this couple had for this acute problem that they were solving, and it was actually making a difference. So while on the one hand, yes, we've got the drugs and vaccines, and we've got the technologies out there, we need innovation. Right. And innovation sometimes means, how do you take simple ideas and then implement them in a way that's scalable and sustainable?
And in a billion years, sitting in New York, Seattle, or San Francisco, you're never going to figure that one out.
We'll be underwater by then, but
right.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, a billion years, right? Yeah. That's not a very precise measure of time. No. In a year of sitting around and thinking of it, you'd never come up with that. I mean, that's like being in market, being thoughtful about the problems people are having, and doing something about it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I have to say, when for those of us in the global health community, I mean, we welcome discussions and engagement by people like out here who are really some of the most brilliant thinkers and doers that at least I've met, and love to talk to them.
And if nothing else, there's a checkbook involved.
Yeah, there's a checkbook, but I mean, really, it really is more about their ideas. And
I mean, I think it is interesting that there's a relatively big checkbook involved when you get people like, didn't Gates and Buffett sort of combine their fortunes because they kind of figured out you could probably have more impact?
Well, I mean, what Warren Buffett said, as I recall, is that look, Bill Gates was doing it really well. I mean, why would he want to set up his own foundation and do something in parallel? I would say the only caution I would say in terms of writing a check, it's really easy. It's also really easy to perturb a situation by writing a check, because then what happens is people follow the money. You know, I'll do that if you want me to. Just write me a check for it, even though it may not be the best thing to do.
That has got to be brutally hard to untangle.
It's hard. It's really hard. I mean, as somebody who's been involved in this area and actually, applying for grants, there were times when I turned grants down because it was taking us off track. Mm-hmm. And it's a hard thing to do, to turn down money.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this is great. I think we've done this thing. What do you think?
It was great. I was really fun.
This is cool.
Thanks so much.
All right. Dan Carucci, the guest.
And thank you, Kent.
And I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
This has been the Something Venture podcast. I'll talk to you next time. Thanks.